the key takeaways from this for your midterm essays would be the looking glass self, which is a theory on self and our perceptions of self and how that's formed, and then mass media socialization. And that's where we left off last week. And I believe it was Joe raised a question. Joe, you out there? I think we just have one, Joe.
Yeah, I'm here.
Kind of, we were looking at this more advanced theory of hegemony and, how the ruling class is able to manufacture consent and mass media. And that dominance by, very concentrated corporate thing. And some of the research on, mean world syndrome and what we're seeing, what we're viewing. Is it intentional? This kind of, culture of fear and a lot of this, crisis to crisis covering thing I mentioned, a study called Policing the Crisis, which we'll talk about again. But generally, that's kind of how we're seeing with mass media socialization. You heard me say this a couple of times. It's the race for your eyeballs, right? They don't want you to take off those screens. And, your life's attention, basically, Henry James, a philosopher, said, what your life is determined by what you choose to choose your attention towards. So if you're constantly clicking and choosing and screen time rather than, real, what is your, so we'll get into some of this with mass media socialization again. Some of this is intentional, kind of this, what's being seen and kind of controlling discourses, things like this. And this is the big academic debate on, the political discourse and all this around the world. Any questions for me before we get started? And that kind of gets us into, and some of the studies on this, a lot of this blends into social psychology, which kind of broke off. As you guys know, if you doodle around a little bit looking at sociology and the origins and how it broke off into economics, political science, and psychology. What we believe is what we perceive, right? So, emotions, assign value to things, right? And they undergird reason. We don't really make reasonable, rational judgments, do we? A lot of the study and the evidence over the years have pointed to that, that our emotions kind of trump out the strategic reason is the rational part of the mind. And, this looks at where we start off with socialization and theories on this, this big grand debate that's been going on in sociology and how much, that becoming a productive member of society, right, with good character, a moral type of compass, knowing right from wrong, working, building families, having kids, volunteering if you have time in the community, looking out for your neighbor, taking time to educate yourself and educate your kids if you have you. And, being a product, that's the whole thing why civil societies and liberal democratic societies can work. Only if you have people doing that, right? And that's kind of what the idea of the university was formed, that, to have that, to shape the individuals. And that's the whole goal here, isn't it? Right? You don't want a lot of people in mass society not properly integrated and properly socialized, not working, not engaging in formal networks, that type of stuff. So this goes down to how the personalities are formed, and most of you in here, I can see you've been socialized properly. You're productive members of society. You're going to college, which is a monumental task. And you guys seem to have good character. I mean, okay, I could judge you guys up a little bit more in a face-to-face class. But you guys, are following basic morals and basic codes and mores and norms and those type of things. But this debate on the socialization process gets into how the personality form and how much, your, social self is formed by, heredity and genes, or how much is it, from the social environment, right? There's pretty much no one sociologist or psychologist is going to say it's one or the other. It's a combination of both. There's a lot about genetics that they don't know, genetic loading and things like that. Some things we do know, but it only gives us a little window into the self and personality and the individual. A lot of the evidence and a lot of the stuff sociology works at and looks into is obviously that social environment, right? Those social forces that make you human, right? And makes you a conforming, member of society, productive, working, and those type of things. And this all begins from an early age. I'm not sure how many people have kids in the class. A few. Anybody?
I have kids, 2 boys.
Okay, I was going to say we got to have a few.
I have 2 girls.
Boys, girls, yeah, a couple boys. Yeah, I have a young son, 10-year-old.
I have 4.
4, okay. And you can make some of the stuff of child rearing and, this stuff with classic sociology isn't rocket science, right? Much of the stuff goes back centuries, right, in raising, right, human beings and children and all that type of stuff, right? And what it tends to show is that, that constant, right, interaction from an early age, the reading, the Socratic dialogue, raising questions, not answering them, but raising more questions for them, making them go find it out for themselves, because the whole deal is, you don't want to make the road for them. You don't want to, pave everything for them and make it a nice, you want them to be their own person and find that out for themselves, right? There's a scholar by the name of Jonathan Haidt, I probably mentioned him before, looked at it's the coddling of the American mind. There's another one called Unequal Childhoods. Right? And one of the best things you could do when you're just coming out of, summer vacation, dealing with boredom, not having a parent hovering over them and saying, this is what you're going to do, X, Y, Z, we're going to cart you from lesson to some, they call it concerted, cultivating parenting, right? Where you just kind of let them deal with boredom, right? You go figure it out. Just go do something, right? You're not going to give you structures. I'm not going to sit there and lay everything out, right? Now, in the last 20 years, you're seeing this big change in that type of stuff, especially amongst the upper classes. And we'll talk a little bit about that later with those socialization processes and kids, because a lot of those parents, whatever the term, sociologists got terms for everything, helicopter parents or snow plow parents, right? You tend to see that from the upper classes. And the middle and working classes tend to be more hands off, and it's like, no, you make the road, you walk, I'll guide you and give you the boots. Because in the end, right, Joe, the whole deal is to work your way out of a job. It sounds terrible, but that's what you want. You want to say, hey, you go your way, right? I gave you the tools, because the system will eat you up if you don't have them, right? It sounds so terrible. Work your way out of a job. But really, that's the whole goal. So you go off and, so this goes back, and, you look at this when learning's arrested early on, when we see this problem with a lot of young people and youth in America because of um, the incarceration, for example, when young kids get very draconian type of 10, 15, 20-year sentences. And there's not much reform. There's some change within prisons and things like that. And then they're thrown back out into society, right? And expected to reacclimate themselves. And it's very hard to catch back up. The same thing is with, drastic things like child abuse and things like that. But those bread and butter things, that constant interaction, and that's how we develop language and how we develop our identities and our perceptions of the world and ourselves, right? And able to develop those type of things. Do you want me to put up a PowerPoint for you on this?
Sure.
So there's all these forces that, make you human and keep you in line. And that's kind of the very classic, sociology on the self. And, some of the studies we talked about with mass media, socialization, and culture, and some of the stuff in the beginning of the class. Political actors, if you will, realized as nation states and civil societies were reforming that people weren't rational beings, right? That they were basically reactionary vessels, if you will, to their emotional state, that their emotions trumped their strategic reasoning, and that they call it in philosophy emotivism, right? And that they basically you could manipulate them, and this is how these these things with identity and stuff comes into being in the early 20th century, with the which threw us into a couple world wars, and we're still really living through the consequences for that. But we're social animals, aren't we? We're very needy beings for a very long time, aren't we? We like to think of ourselves as rugged individuals, but no one wants to go it alone. It's best if you have allies and friends and family and that type of stuff along the way. And some of that is contrary to how some of us are socialized as well, especially with boys. You're seeing, if you've checked out some of the extra resources I provide, and this already, is there's a big problem with boys, right, and men in general in American society, but is how we're raising boys in particular. The girls and the women are doing all right, right? But we have this, there's a book called Boys Adrift, all types of studies on this. Jackson Katz looks like this. And some of this points to how masculinity, is constructed in Western societies. And it's having a negative effect on boys. And it's manifested early on in the schools. That couple of you said you got boys in the class. Was it Melissa?
Yeah.
And what happens especially in America, and you don't see this in European social democracies, but they're putting kids in school, even girls, too early. And a lot of times people have to do this because of, we don't have universal childcare. So the school serves as, doubles with learning as well as, childcare. But that's not necessarily a good thing based on pedagogy and learning and cognitive science, because boys especially, but girls as well, 5 years old, their bodies are telling them just go, rough it up, play, explore, learn how to right? Take the role of the other. That's George Herbert Mead's theory on the self, right? Being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And that's where that socialization process comes into being. Is we're able to develop an emotional self, right? And see ourselves and others, and, you know, to be able to have civilized relationships with people. And that can only be done, you know, through just going out there and playing and doing all that type of stuff, the unstructured stuff, right? School is doing the opposite, right? 5 years old, it's telling your body to stop, sit, listen. We're going to treat you like a clerical worker, basically for 6 hours, because that's different lecture, different chapter. That's how public schooling is in most school districts in America. It's not a lot of project-based stuff. It's very individualized. And many critics of that say it's very outdated as well. Other societies don't do it that way, right? They acknowledge the studies on child rearing and young people and know that they have to work with others. The world doesn't work that way, right? You have to, learning comes in groups. Well, when we break off today after the lecture this morning, look at Changing Educational Paradigms, if you haven't already, by Ken Robinson. And it's an animated lecture, but it really gets into the point of this with learning and studies on learning and the study Breakpoint and Beyond on divergent learning. And what that study found was that we all start with, and this gets into that debate on nature and nurture. We all start with that genius, you know, ability, right? We all test very high for that, you know. But once kids get in school, it largely deteriorates, right? And you would think that, you know, you start off as genius, right? And you get better, right? Through school. And that's what school should do, right? Make you a complete person, right? Broad-minded, develop interest, you know, critical thinking, all that jazz, right? But largely this study, it showed that that genius level largely deteriorates among especially American school kids. That's a problem, right? And some of the research on this, on learning in schools, I'm getting kind of ahead of myself in the lecture, but this is important to note, is pointing to how we're schooling them. You know, I mentioned, you know, treating them like clerical workers, and they sit there and they take tests constantly. They take an on average, and that's because of, you know, policy on schooling, no child left behind policies. So the average person that comes out of high school would have taken about 120 standardized tests through his whole K through 12 experience, right? Now, on the other side of that, they would have, the studies on mass media and television and screen time, video games included, that American school kids will also, right, spend more time, listen to this statistic, will spend more time in front of a TV or a screen before they reach kindergarten than they would have spent in their whole K through 12 experience in school, just before they reach kindergarten. Think about that. No one seems to acknowledge, like, some of these, is like, does anyone see the inconsistencies with this? And, you know, how are we going to address this? And so this a whole body, and of course a lot of the younger people have grown up with, you know, the Facebooks and the social media and some of that stuff and the smartphones. So this is the big current academic debate, you know, what's going on the generation that has grown up with that. They call it Generation Z now in sociology. They've grown up with the smartphones and stuff like that. So this is kind of budding early, you know, research on all this stuff, and this is the big debate. Jonathan Haidt, I mentioned in his book, Coddling of the American Mind, gets into a lot of studies on that. But some of the classic studies on this is emotions assign value to things and kind of undergrid reasoning. So I promised put up a, let me see if I can find something. Here we go. Can you see this?
Yeah.
Yes.
Questions
Yeah.
so far, any of that? So you can have a lot of fun with this question on the midterm essays. So when we look at psychological theories of the self, remember that psychologists are more just looking at individual behavior. Sociology, we're looking at that larger structural and social environment, the macro, analysis on individual. But this goes back to classic sociology. I'm sorry, psychology, and I'm going to spend a whole lot of time on this and cognitive development. How we obtain and use information, things on Goldberg with moral development. When you look at Maslow's hierarchy and all this type of stuff. And one of the things that psychology discovered, like I had said, is that we don't. And it was a false idea that reason, that was kind of one of the false myths about the Enlightenment, that we're rational, right? And we're motivated by reason, and we're rational beings. And the studies contradict that, right? That we're not, right? We make decisions based on our emotional self. Not through rational judgments. And we want to understand things right now, right? Our intuitions. We don't get to strategic reasoning, right? Where we do deductive reasoning and take things apart. Now it's just, over mass media saturated society. It's gone crazy with this. So you have your physical self, your intellectual self, your cognitive self, and then your whether you believe in a higher being or don't, a soul, something, a spiritual self, kind of inner self that deals with the emotional aspect of that self. Right? And it's important to balance those three. That one part of the self. This is classic philosophy. This goes back to Athens. Is to properly nourish all three, right? And balance and make decisions within those three, and work at that, on a daily basis. And this has spawned, numerous, if not millions, of self-help books on the self and being all you can be type of things. And it's made a lot of psychologists very wealthy. And kind of taking from these theories, cosmic sociology, we call it, or cosmics, psychology, because people want to know, they're hungry for, how to, this kind of came out of the 60s, things like that. But Freud, one of the things in his studies, looked at that, Franz Kafka, the scholar, wrote that the irrational takes over the rational and makes decisions. So the irrational has become the rational. And very people in power realize they could, manipulate people in groups through that emotive self, right? And it's still used today, right? Generally, the way people vote, is based on, popularity and appealing to that very broad core of that emotional self, right? It's not really, you don't get a lot of rational type of discourse or discussing of issues or things like that. So those are classic psychological ones. So now the sociology, and that's something that, are you able to see this whole screen here?
It's kind of like partial. Do you think you could full screen it?
Yeah, let me, because I got talking. Better?
Yes, sir.
So George Herbert Mead, I'm sorry, Cooley's Looking Glass Self, right? How do we develop a picture of how we see ourselves and our view of who we are and our perceptions of the world, right? This is a classic study on that, that physical active self, the social self, your psychological self, that soul, that emotional self. How does that come into being? And when we're young kids, and you remember that with having kids, where they did that, where they covered their eyes and they say, "You can't see me," right? Well, Mead would say, and Cooley as well, that kid hasn't developed the other, right? Hasn't been able to develop a sense of the generalized other, that there's things other than themselves. Right. So Cooley looked at this with the looking glass self. And this is a question on your midterm essays again. And he used this three-part process. And it turns out that our perceptions of ourself, right, are largely based on what? Many may have heard of this theory or and known about this from other classes or just your own experience. How do we develop our self-concept? Cooley said that acts as a social mirror. Is it through our own perceptions on ourselves and our own accurate evaluations of ourselves?
Isn't it through others? How others see us?
Yeah. Yeah, it's how we perceive, how we perceive. Was that Robin that said that? How the others see us, right? How we imagine how we appear, to people, right? And according to Cooley, we're constantly doing this as young kids and as well as adults. Generally, I mean, we're social animals. We want to belong, don't we? Right? No one wants to be excluded from the group, especially when you're a young kid. And so we're constantly going to, well, do they like me because I got new shoes, or I got whatever, a new pair of Jordans, or I got a new, football, or new baseball bat, or whatever, right? And then we start evaluating ourselves and drawing conclusions about ourselves. So a lot of our perception, our self-concept is kind of skewed, isn't it? It's not based on accurate and favorable reflections, right? It tends to be just based on our interpretation of how others see us, right? And we build those interpretations into our, self-concept and feelings about ourselves and the ideas we have about ourselves. And of course, that gets into things like self-esteem and things like that. And do you think adults do that as much as kids? Or do kids do it more, or do adults do it more? Joe, you're shaking your head.
Oh, I think we all do it. I think kids are more obvious about it because they want to seem individual and unique. But if you look at them, it's almost like they're wearing a uniform. They wear clothes the same way. They act the same way. They don't go anywhere without their phones because they want to be able to contact and other people to be able to contact them. And they're not as individual as they want to think they are.
Yeah, it tends to be kind of like a swarming herd of elephants, right? And the brain is just kind of like the rider on. That's what I referenced that movie, The Matrix, stepping out of that. But when you really start, sing and check back and see, adults tend to do that as well too, don't they?
Absolutely.
consumer societies, that's how, I mean, and you look at the studies on, something as basic as naming a kid, how that's chosen. Um, and some of that, we're very, very, very predictable, species. And some of that can be based on, inaccurate, interpretations, because, some of the studies show that, no one's paying attention to your new pair of shoes, or your new pair of um, pants, or whatever, or your new, I mean, who sees your new, 65-inch TV? The quest for consumer and consumption, the more things. And it's led to kind of a crisis in material consumption, where a lot of the storage space, you see the billions and billions of storage space that's popped up over the last 20 years. A lot of that is, some of it's for people that are in transition and moving. Some of it is for people just storing the things, right? And that goes back to conspicuous consumption and those type of things. Keeping up with the Joneses, et cetera. And that whole thing, we talked about that with consumer culture. A lot of it is geared towards getting you this whole thing that fulfillment and life fulfillment can be filled through material possessions, and that's a false sense of identity and self, and false way really to live. So a lot of that doesn't depend, moral of the story, on accurate evaluations. A lot of it is based on misinterpreted things and misjudgments. Fascinating work on this type of stuff. I mentioned Hyatt's book, Coddling an American Mind, and then The Righteous Mind is another one he wrote on how good people are divided by politics and religion. Good reads if you're interested in something on this subject. So Looking Glass Self, you can have a lot of fun with this, right? And it's how our perception of ourselves is formed, and the uses of it in today. So meat and roll taking. I mentioned that with the kid that puts his hands over his eyes. Any questions on Cooley's Looking Glass Self? Pretty straightforward theories for socialization. So, what Mead observed children at play in his early studies, and he came up with how we learn to take the role of the other, right? And when you look at kids play, and it's fun. It's one of my favorite pastimes is to watch young kids, just kind of improvise and play and get into their creative minds. But a lot of what students do, I mean, young kids do, when they play, they do what? When we play, and this goes
Pretend.
back to, yeah, pretend, right? And we pretend what, Melissa?
Anything that we're somewhere else, someone else.
Yeah. But specifically, we're kind of, we will do that, maybe dressing up in your parents' clothes, right?
Yeah.
Or tearing through your closet and, playing dress up, playing house, playing nurse, or playing playing school, boys, reenacting, their favorite NFL player, whatever. Cops and robbers, good guys and bad guys, all these type of things. And that's where real learning comes, if there's some of the classic in cognitive development, where you just let kids be free to improvise and harness their creative self and imagine, goes, it's very simple stuff. Go out and play, right? Just go. The world's a lot safer, than when you would see by turning on your TV or opening up the newspaper. Obviously we got a pandemic going on, but generally, hanging out on the street and roughing it up and getting dirty and going out, not having the parent hovering over them is really good stuff. And I think you said you have 2 boys, Melissa, was it?
Yes, that's correct.
How old are they?
They are 15 and 20. Yeah.
Developing
little.
into manhood, huh? Embarking on
Yeah.
manhood.
Yes, but they were, we were outside, unless it was, so cold that you would freeze in 5 minutes of being out there. My boys were outside a majority of life.
Yeah. And that's where real learning, you play. You don't sit down when you're 5 years old and learn math problems and spelling and things like that. It's way better just to. Did you put your boys into school when they were 5 years old or 6, may I ask?
Yeah, of course. I did. My oldest he started when he was 6. And my youngest actually started when he was 4, because he has a really late birthday. He did 2 years of preschool.
Okay. Yeah, it's situational too. Some kids are ready for it, but it's kind of good.
For sure.
A lot of the studies show is definitely don't do it until they're fully 5, or at least 6 or 6 if you can.
Yeah, and had I known that back then, I probably would have waited. And my younger one was very, he was the crazy one. He was just, all boy and just a wild child. And I was, really afraid when he went to school, but it kind of settled him down, and he did just fine. And it was just, it was just a few hours a morning. But yeah, it ended up being okay.
Yeah, and a lot of schooling is, a lot of, I use the phrase clerical work. You're sitting there, you do, and I'm speaking specifically to American schooling. Other countries, don't do that. They've ditched standardized tests years ago. That when I was in the Netherlands, I was in a seminar, and the one guy, professor goes, everyone knows over here that the problem with what you guys do is really basic. Is your problem is you give tests. We don't give tests, right? It's all project-based group type of things. You'll work with the same group of kids, say from 1st grade to 3rd grade, right? And they'll be just all based. We're really still stuck in the 20th century with that, and there's separate reasons for that, which we'll look at when we get into the stuff on the sociology of education. But it's starting to be a problem. Learning, these stages he laid out, this isn't always set, but generally, you look at that with interaction and play, those really, I guess, the golden era of childhood from 3 to 6, right? Where everything was just sensory overboard. Generalize other. So generally, it extends beyond your family, your to the generalized other, the group as a whole, your friends, your peer group, and things like that. This allows us to modify, our behaviors and act, and keep in line and keep ourselves, and being a civilized person with that. Mead used the analogy of baseball with the self and social control. But yeah, the bottom line is to get us into becoming, productive members of society in that social era, and to make it work for the collective whole as a general. So the last part of this today, different scholars put different emphasis on these different agents of socialization. Some in the studies show this. The family is still very important, even with schooling, right? It all comes back to the family and the caregivers, the mother, the father, or what have you, wherever it might be. And that's something you see that a lot with American education is, parents, maybe more toward the upper classes, obsessed about where their kid's going to school, and that's going to make a difference. And a lot of the studies on that are, inconclusive on that. And a lot of the studies do point back to the family, that you're always constantly, one, you're not hovering over them all the time, telling them what to do, and, planned activities. We're going to go to soccer practice, cart you off to soccer practice, then you're going to go to, violin practice, then you're going to do Girl Scouts or whatever after that. That is just more, making the road you walk. But then also that constant interacting, questioning, raising questions, is very important. Now, what's happened to the family, right? In the 70s, divorce rates have increased. Work life has increased due to wages and living standards and housing and things like that. So you're seeing a lot, especially amongst that big middle and working class, that the mom and dad or whoever's taking care of you isn't there, right? Latch screen kids, and that the school, is doing a lot of that. I mean, there's even studies, I think I might have mentioned that last week, a recent one with these 24-hour daycare centers, where parents, have to work a second, third shift job, and they go drop off their kid at this daycare center, and there's basically cots. I was listening to an interview of this sociologist that did this study, and I can't imagine that, dropping your kid off at 10:30 at night and going to work in a factory for 8 hours, and then coming back in the morning and then taking him to school, hoping he's all right. So some are looking at the school and the peer group and family and work big time, and that's effect on the family, wages, living standards, housing, all these things factor into this. And then some are pointing to, especially with the latest generation of kids coming up, is living in a media saturated society. The bombardment of really a lot of junk. Just over the top. The smartphones, the clicking, the moving from the smartphone to, say streaming service to the laptop to the smartphone, and a lot of it isn't, the screens. If you get a chance, check out, there's a scholar, Tim Wu, called the Attention Merchants. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, some of it, of course, is just the way, progress has moved. But some of the early studies and some of the studies on this stuff is pointing that it's having an adverse effect on people, and kids especially. Some of the stuff I mentioned, that one study earlier in the class a few minutes ago about kids, American school kids, having watched more television and been in front of screens before they reach kindergarten, before they're age 5 years old, than they would have spent their whole K through 12 experience, right? So when you're constantly, this media cycle is just cycling in and out, from your Instagrams and your Facebooks and things like that, to, I'm sure most of you in here probably have cable cutters, just use streaming services and things like that, or just antenna TV. So like I said, the emphasis tends to be just based on the scholarship, and there's research showing stuff emphasizing the importance of each of these, but as well as going back to that core, especially when you're young, is having a stable environment when you come home, where you're able to study and read and explore and have someone providing that for you. Who knows with mass media and schools, because I think you're probably going to get sick of me hearing this, but the Great Reset, Richard Florida was a sociologist, I believe, is coined with the term the Great Reset, that we're heading for a Great Reset. And I think we're living amongst that, right? Living in the midst of the Great Reset. And a lot of it is going to schools to reform, including colleges, obviously having a drastic impact on families and how that works, and have us looked at really what is important in life, and going back to kids and the individuals, and even with mass media, it's relatively new, what the web and the smartphones. I mean, it's just in the last really 8 years that smartphones really came into their own, and the internet is what it was. I mean, I would even argue 10 years ago, I myself included was very leery about even doing any commerce online, right? Using my credit card online, or using online banking or things like that. And even, you looked at when it all came into being, people never took it seriously, right? Especially with e-commerce. Amazon kind of rolled the dice and went with that back in 2005 when they launched. And they maybe earlier, and they did it through books. That something else will be cool now, right? That's the same that's how trends and societies work. Music is that way, movies is that way. Politics is that way, parenting styles is that way, the way we raise kids, there's always something new coming. And then with mass media, probably very plausible, that something's going to come and replace all of that. I mean, there's tons of studies on that, because it's the novelty of it will wear off, and generally that's what happens with trends. It's still kind of cool, especially now that we've been forced kind of back into our communities and forced, inside. We're using it more and more, and I think a lot of people are just like craving, like, to go, and have human contact, checking on a neighbor, or that type of stuff. So we'll see. This is, what. When you look at gender, we'll get into talk a little bit about this, how girls and boys, the difference between this and socialization sends them in different paths, big time. You guys got any questions on any of this stuff? pretty straightforward. I'll ask you, and it can combine with mass media socialization and some of the stuff we talked about at the end of the lecture last week with culture and media industries and some studies with that, Noam Chomsky's manufacturing consent, Gramsci's hegemony, how that dominant group, subordinate group dynamic, and the dominant group, this would be conflict theory. An example of conflict theory, controlling ideas and information. There's only so many people, right, and so many companies, really. If anyone looked at that known and unknown article I posted, what we're seeing, there's very few corporations with big tech, even within finance and banking, or pharmaceutical, with pharmaceutical drugs and health insurance, and then media, right, and that type of stuff. It's very concentrated. And tends to be monopolized by a very concentrated group of people. So this has been an ongoing debate for decades in sociology on this and its uses. Is it intentional? Is it unintended consequences, et cetera, et cetera. So you can have a lot of fun with that, and we'll come back to that a little bit with groupthink next week and confirmation bias, and then some of the studies on group conformity, Milgram experiment, Stanford Prison experiment. We'll talk about confirmation bias, groupthink. Will be next week. Any questions on any of this? So of important note today for your midterm essays, looking glass self, and you probably can see now how things are intersecting in sociology, and then mass media socialization. So you can start working and go ahead and use the rest of the time this morning to kind of click and see. Poke around in the modules there and look at some stuff. Questions?
At one point in time, you had a slide, or you gave us a list of things that you wanted to see in our paper, I think. And where can we find that? Because I looked around for it, and I
for
don't
the
know.
midterm essays?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I just put the recording up on those, but I think I remember, Joe. Hold on, give me a second. I will put those up. Thanks for reminding me of that. There'll be a concise study guide.
All right, thank you.
But I will put, I actually will do it now, Joe. Thanks for reminding me. Yeah, and start working on that media analysis paper. And remember on that paper as well, I gave you an option to create your own assignment based on everything we've been studying. So what for the midterm? See, we're on I didn't talk about dramaturgy, did I, last week? Irving Goffman's.
No, I don't believe so.
Talked a little bit about the social construction of reality. I'll put key concepts so far. Okay, and you see it there, Joe, in the announcements?
Just a moment, please.
The rest of you following what we're talking about?
Yes, I have it.
You see it there, Joe?
Yes, thank you.
I'll go ahead and send it to your email too.
I see it. Thank you.
My pleasure, no problem. By any means, feel free to email me if you guys have any questions. I'll put key concepts so far. Yeah, and the whole design of my own is to you learn more by writing and exploring and applying these concepts. Then there we go. So if you check your email, do you if you guys don't have any other questions, yeah, I sent it in the email too. It's in the announcement in the email. So we'll pick up next week. Go ahead and spend some time organizing your notes. You know, you can start working on those midterm essays. Start working on media analysis paper. You know, view some of that stuff I have in the modules. I mentioned a couple things. All right. Well, you guys have a good rest of your morning and good start to your
Sorry.
Tuesday.
You
I
too.
do
Yes,
have a
go ahead.
question. So like, I know we're supposed to be doing a research for like our midterm paper. So right now, is he supposed to be working on our thesis or something? Or just
For your
research?
midterm essays, yeah, I put, those are the stuff I just sent out. Each lecture, like I said, you know, there's key concepts that'll be on your midterm essays. You know, so you use the time, you know, after the lectures to research that stuff and, you know, go reference the scholars I mentioned. You can go listen to the recordings again, you know, do your own web-based research on those concepts and theories. And then, you know, when it comes time for that stuff to be due, you submit it and it looks really good. And it has a lot of depth and thoroughness to it and analysis.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right, well, shoot me an email if you have any questions. If you need to meet up, Zoom meet up outside of this, let me know. Other than that, have a good day.
You too. Thank you.
All right, take care,
Yeah.
Melissa, Joe.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Everybody else.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.